1800, Napoleon's star was at its zenith. Only a year earlier, he had crowned himself Emperor of the French. Across the Rhine, the old powers of Europe seethed. Britain funded coalitions. Austria and Russia prepared new armies. The Habsburg Empire, humiliated by French victories in Italy and Bavaria, believed it had one last chance to stop Napoleon before he dominated the continent. The spark came in early October. Napoleon's Grande Armée, reorganized into flexible corps, was marching with unprecedented speed across Germany. His goal: outflank the Austrian army under General Mack at Ulm and force it to surrender before Russian reinforcements arrived. While history books often dwell on Ulm and Austerlitz, one of the strangest and shortest engagements happened as Napoleon closed the jaws of his trap. The so-called Battle of Schönbrunn, sometimes called the skirmish at Vienna's gates, unfolded as Napoleon raced not only to encircle Mack, but to capture the Austrian capital itself. In a war defined by grand armies, this encounter lasted less than a morning, but its psychological and political shockwaves were immense. Napoleon's strength lay not only in numbers but in movement. By autumn 1805, he commanded about 200,000 men organized into corps that could march separately yet fight together. Each corps had its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery, self-contained, mobile, and deadly. Instead of lumbering along a single road, Napoleon's troops fanned out across multiple routes, converging on key points like a tightening net. The Austrian army under General Mack had taken position at Ulm, believing Napoleon would attack through the Black Forest. Instead, the French swept north, crossed the Danube, and cut off the Austrians' line of retreat. As panic spread, Mack's forces fractured. Vienna, though garrisoned, stood vulnerable. Napoleon sensed opportunity. If he could seize the bridges over the Danube before they were destroyed, he could enter Vienna without a costly siege. That would split the coalition, demoralize the Austrians, and give him a secure base for the coming clash with Russia. On the French side, Napoleon entrusted the advance to his daredevil marshals, Murat, Lannes, and others, men famed for audacity. Cavalry under Murat's plumed hat thundered ahead, scouting every crossing and bluffing the enemy when needed. Defending Vienna were a patchwork of Austrian regulars, local militia, and engineers tasked with blowing up bridges to deny the French passage. Their commanders were competent but lacked the emperor's energy. Orders from the court were confused. Some argued for a stand at the city gates. Others urged retreat to join Russian forces. In this vacuum, hesitation reigned. Vienna in 1805 was still a fortified city ringed by suburbs, gardens, and the estates of the nobility. The Danube's branching channels created islands and causeways, ideal choke points but also liabilities if engineers failed to destroy them in time. Among these crossings, the Tabor Bridge and the approaches near Schönbrunn Palace were crucial. Schönbrunn itself, the Habsburgs' summer residence, sat amid manicured grounds southwest of the city. Capturing it would place French troops at Vienna's back door. More importantly, it symbolized the Austrian monarchy. For Napoleon, to take Schönbrunn quickly was to show Europe that no crown was safe from him. On the evening of October 12th, French cavalry scouts in blue and red edged toward the outer suburbs. The air smelled of wet leaves and gunpowder. Murat received intelligence that the Austrians had not yet blown the bridges. Napoleon, traveling with his headquarters column, urged his marshals to act with celerity, his favorite word for speed. Inside Vienna, confusion deepened. Civilians crowded the streets, wagons piled high with furniture and linens, nobles fleeing toward Hungary. Austrian engineers set charges on the Tabor Bridge but hesitated to light them until the last possible moment. Meanwhile, small detachments guarded Schönbrunn's approaches with a handful of cannon and muskets, hardly enough to stop an imperial juggernaut. One of the most remarkable episodes of the march involved deception. Murat and the French envoy Savary approached Austrian outposts in white uniforms resembling Austrian coats, claiming they were envoys under a flag of truce to negotiate Vienna's surrender. While Austrian officers parleyed, French sappers slipped onto the bridge and cut the fuses of the charges. When the ruse was discovered, it was too late. The bridge was in French hands. This blend of bluff and speed epitomized Napoleon's way of war. He did not always need a pitched battle. Sometimes a few bold moves could achieve the same strategic result in minutes. The stage was now set for the brief but decisive fight at Schönbrunn, the shortest battle of his career. By pre-dawn on October 13th, roughly 10,000 French troops were massed on the western approaches to Vienna, with cavalry screens stretching farther. Artillery rumbled into position under the mist. Drums beat low. Many soldiers believed they were about to storm the capital itself. Across the field, only a few thousand Austrians, engineers, grenadiers, and armed townsmen, stood in their path. They had barricaded a bridge, set up a battery near a tree-lined lane, and placed pickets around Schönbrunn Palace. Morale was brittle. Rumors spread that the emperor himself was with the French vanguard, which proved true. Napoleon, always aware of the psychological dimension, made sure he was visible. Riding at the front in his plain gray coat, he presented the image not of a distant sovereign but of a commander ready to risk his life. For soldiers on both sides, the sight was electrifying. Dawn broke gray and wet over the Danube. The fog was so thick men could barely see the colors of their own flags. French voltigeurs moved silently along hedgerows toward the barricaded bridge while artillery crews unlimbered their guns. Murat's cavalry waited just out of sight, sabers drawn, horses snorting clouds into the chill. At 6 a.m., a single French cannon fired. The ball struck the Austrian barricade with a thunderclap that echoed across the river. Muskets cracked back in reply. For a heartbeat, the fight looked like it might become a bloody stand. But before the defenders could reload, French skirmishers surged forward at the double. They vaulted the debris, bayonets flashing, and poured onto the bridge. The Austrian engineers tried desperately to light the remaining fuses. They never got the chance. A musket ball cut down their sergeant. Another snapped the slow match. Within minutes, the charges were thrown into the river. The bridge, Vienna's lifeline, was in French hands. Even as the bridge fell, Murat unleashed his horsemen. Thousands of French and Allied cavalry thundered across the planks in a rolling wave of blue and gold. Dragoons dismounted on the far side to clear houses while hussars galloped into the streets, sabers flashing at every corner. Austrian pickets fired a few scattered volleys and then broke. Some tried to form squares in the open but were trampled before they could lock bayonets. Others threw down their muskets and begged for quarter. The sight of Murat's plumed hat at the head of the charge sent a shudder through the defenders. The cavalier of Europe was upon them, and they knew his reputation. Yet one knot of resistance remained. At Schönbrunn Palace itself, about 2,000 Austrian grenadiers had fortified the gates and garden walls. They had a few light cannon and a reputation for stubbornness. As French skirmishers approached, the Austrians opened fire, sending grapeshot tearing through the hedges. Napoleon rode up personally to reconnoiter. For a moment, he considered a direct assault. But then he did what he always did best. He shifted the pressure point. He ordered his artillery to wheel into the palace grounds on the flank. Under covering fire, voltigeurs crept through the orchards and into the gardens. What happened next felt less like a battle and more like a stage play of deception. French officers called out in fluent German, telling the defenders that Vienna had already surrendered, that they were surrounded, that Murat's cavalry was at their rear. As the cannon boomed and the smoke thickened, Austrian morale cracked. A white flag rose above the palace gates. By 8 a.m., barely 2 hours after the first shot, the firing sputtered out. French troops poured into Schönbrunn, stacking captured muskets by the dozen. In the city, bells rang as word spread that Napoleon had entered Vienna without a siege. Civilians peered from windows at the blue-coated columns marching in perfect order. The battle had lasted less than a morning. Casualties were shockingly low for a Napoleonic engagement, a few dozen on each side. Yet the psychological impact was enormous. The Austrian capital, symbol of Habsburg might, had fallen in a flicker of gun smoke and audacity. That evening, Napoleon established his headquarters inside Schönbrunn itself, the very rooms where Maria Theresa had held court and Mozart had performed. He wrote to Josephine that night with understated pride, "Vienna is ours." By seizing the city so quickly, he had accomplished what entire campaigns had failed to do: break Austria's will to fight and split the coalition before Russia could arrive in force. Even though the war continued, culminating in the masterpiece of Austerlitz, the fall of Vienna gave Napoleon the initiative and the supplies he needed for winter operations. For Austria, the humiliation was acute. Vienna had fallen with hardly a fight. The Habsburg court fled to Hungary. Their armies reeled back toward Moravia. The loss of the capital undermined morale and made it harder to rally allies. Although Austrian troops would still fight bravely at Austerlitz, the psychological edge was gone. Later generations would look back on the skirmish at Schönbrunn as the shortest and strangest battle of Napoleon's career. It showed that speed, deception, and nerve could achieve what brute force could not. Napoleon himself often spoke of winning without fighting as the highest art of war. Schönbrunn was his proof. It also foreshadowed the future of warfare. Rapid maneuver, psychological shock, and flexible formations, these were the hallmarks of modern operations. In 2 hours on an October morning, Napoleon had demonstrated principles that military academies still teach today. From Vienna, Napoleon launched the moves that would trap the Russians and Austrians at Austerlitz 6 weeks later. That battle, the Son of Austerlitz, would be remembered as his greatest triumph. But it was the capture of Vienna and the micro-battle at Schönbrunn that set the stage. Without it, the coalition might have regrouped, the Russians might have linked with Max survivors, and history could have turned differently. Picture the scene once more. Mist curling off the Danube, the gray figure in a bicorn riding through the palace gates, Austrian muskets stacked like firewood in surrender. In barely 2 hours, Napoleon had taken the heart of an empire. What does this teach us? That war is not always decided by the bloodiest field, but sometimes by a moment of audacity. A bluff at a bridge, a dash across a river, a psychological stroke that makes an enemy's will crumble before the battle truly begins. As you watch this channel, think of how many other turning points in history were just as sudden, just as strange, and just as decisive.